On December 19, 1777, the Continental Army marched into Valley Forge. They did not look like the army of a victorious nation. They looked like men who had survived too much and had not yet been paid enough for surviving it. Their coats were thin, their shoes were broken or missing. Some wrapped feet in rags, some left bloody marks on frozen roads. Wagons creaked behind them, horses strained. Officers tried to keep order while men scanned the Pennsylvania hills for shelter, food, and any sign that winter might be merciful. The army had just lived through a year of contradiction. In the north, Burgoyne had surrendered at Saratoga, and the world had been forced to notice the American cause. In Pennsylvania, Washington had lost Brandywine, failed at Germantown, and watched British troops occupy Philadelphia. So Valley Forge began with an uncomfortable truth. America had won a victory that might bring France into the war, but Washington's own army was still in danger of disappearing. The position was chosen because it sat close enough to watch the British in Philadelphia, but far enough to avoid a sudden attack. The Schuylkill River and nearby ridges gave some protection. Roads connected the camp to the countryside. From the heights, Washington could guard Congress's remaining authority, protect supplies, and prevent the British from roaming freely through Pennsylvania. But a good strategic position was not the same as a good home. There were no barracks waiting, no warm stores of food, no neat rows of winter shelters. Valley Forge had to be built by men who were already hungry. Washington understood the danger. His army was not merely cold, it was politically fragile. Men could desert, states could neglect their quotas. Congress could argue while soldiers starved. Critics could ask whether another general might do better. The British in Philadelphia could enjoy occupied comfort while the rebel army shivered in the hills. And yet, Washington also understood why the army had to remain together. If it scattered for the winter, discipline could collapse. If it moved too far away, the British would control the region. If he risked a battle while weak, the army could be destroyed. Valley Forge was not a retreat from the war. It was a gamble that endurance could become strategy. The first task was shelter. Soldiers cut timber and raised huts in rows. Each hut was crude, crowded, and smoky, but it was a wall between the army and the winter. Men who had fought at Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, Germantown, Bennington, and Saratoga now became builders, carpenters, ditch diggers, and woodcutters. The camp began to take shape like a rough city. Roads, guard posts, brigade areas, bake ovens, blacksmiths, hospitals, headquarters, and parade grounds emerged from snow and mud. Smoke rose from hundreds of huts. Axes rang through the woods. Still, construction did not solve hunger. It did not solve disease. It did not solve politics. Valley Forge was only beginning. The most famous image of Valley Forge is cold, but cold was only part of the suffering. The army's deeper enemy was supply. Food did not arrive when promised. Meat spoiled or vanished. Flour ran short. Wagons broke. Horses died. Roads became mud. Farmers feared worthless paper money and preferred selling to the British in Philadelphia, who could often pay in hard coin. State governments argued. Congress lacked power. Quartermasters struggled to create order in a system that was still being invented under pressure. Soldiers did not experience that as policy. They experienced it as empty stomachs. A man in a hut did not care which committee had failed. He cared that breakfast had not come. He cared that his blanket was thin, that smoke stung his eyes, that his shirt was filthy, that his boots had split, that the man beside him was coughing blood, and that rumors said the British were warm in Philadelphia. Disease became the great killer of the encampment. Influenza, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and other illnesses moved through crowded huts and hospitals. The army gathered men from many states into tight quarters, where sanitation was difficult and medical knowledge was limited. Surgeons did what they could with inadequate supplies. Nurses, wives, and camp followers performed labor that kept many men alive and went too often unrecorded. Valley Forge was not an army of soldiers alone. Women cooked, washed, mended, nursed, carried water, tended children, and helped turn military encampment into a human settlement. Some were wives of enlisted men, some were paid for necessary work. Some had nowhere else to go. Their presence complicates any simple picture of the camp. This was not a silent line of heroic men suffering in isolation. It was a crowded world of families, laborers, servants, free and enslaved black people, teamsters, artisans, sutlers, officers, and ordinary soldiers all trying to survive. Black soldiers served in the Continental Army as well, free and enslaved, northern and southern, fighting for a revolution that spoke of liberty while living inside the contradictions of slavery. In some huts, men who had been denied full freedom shared danger with men who spoke loudly of rights. Their service would become part of the unfinished meaning of the revolution. Washington wrote with urgency. He warned that unless supplies improved, the army might starve, dissolve, or disperse. His letters were not theatrical exaggerations. They were attempts to force Congress and the states to understand that independence required more than declarations and battlefield courage. It required shoes. It required wagons. It required flour, salt, cattle, medicine, blankets, axes, and money that people trusted. At times, men went days with little food. At times, units were too poorly clothed for duty. Desertion was real. Frustration was real. Anger was real. And yet, the army did not vanish. Men grumbled and stayed. Officers complained and stayed. Women worked and stayed. Washington's command survived because enough people, under miserable conditions, still believed the cause had not yet spent them entirely. Valley Forge was suffering, but it was also stubbornness made visible. While soldiers fought hunger and sickness, Washington fought politics. The victory at Saratoga had made Horatio Gates famous. Gates had commanded the army that received Burgoyne's surrender, even though the victory had depended on many hands. Schuyler's delaying strategy, Arnold's aggression, Morgan's riflemen, militia numbers, Kosciuszko's defenses, and Burgoyne's mistakes. Still, the public saw Gates standing at the moment of triumph. Washington, by contrast, had lost Philadelphia. That comparison gave his critics room to speak. Some members of Congress wondered whether Washington was too cautious. Some officers resented him. Some ambitious men thought the war might be better led by someone else. The cluster of criticism, later remembered as the Conway Cabal, was not a single neat conspiracy with one master plan, but it reflected real anxiety about leadership. Thomas Conway, an Irish-born French officer serving in the Continental Army, criticized Washington and praised Gates. Letters moved, rumors spread, names appeared. Washington learned enough to know that he was being judged by men who did not carry his burdens. He did not explode in public. That was not his way. Washington's power often came from restraint, but he could be cold when wounded. He let men know he saw them. He defended his command without surrendering dignity. The crisis mattered because armies are held together by more than orders. They are held by confidence. If Congress lost confidence in Washington, if officers split into factions, if soldiers believed their sacrifices were being wasted by political intrigue, the army at Valley Forge could fracture from the inside. Washington also had to manage the ambitions and anxieties of his own generals. Charles Lee, recently exchanged after capture by the British, returned with a high opinion of himself and a low opinion of others. Lee was clever, experienced, erratic, and often contemptuous. He believed he understood war better than most American commanders, perhaps better than Washington himself. Nathanael Greene, Henry Knox, Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, Anthony Wayne, Lord Stirling, Lafayette, and others formed the working world around Washington. Some were trusted deeply, some were tested. Some were young men trying to prove themselves in a war that aged everyone quickly. Lafayette became especially important. The young French aristocrat had been wounded at Brandywine and had chosen to remain loyal to Washington when political winds shifted. He admired Washington not merely as a commander, but as a fatherly figure. Washington, who rarely gave affection lightly, warmed to him. Their relationship mattered emotionally and diplomatically. Lafayette connected the American army to France at the very moment France was deciding how far to go. At headquarters, the burden was constant. Washington wrote letters, received petitions, answered Congress, pleaded for supplies, watched the British, managed officers, judged discipline, and tried to keep despair from becoming policy. He was not perfect. He could be severe. He could misjudge. He lived within the inequalities of his age. But at Valley Forge, his central achievement was endurance under pressure. He did not abandon the army. He did not chase applause. He did not let criticism push him into reckless battle. He held the command together when holding it together was itself a strategic act. As the winter deepened, Valley Forge became more than a camp. It became a world. There were streets of huts and paths beaten into snow. There were guard rotations, punishments, prayers, inspections, meals when food arrived, and silence when it did not. There were jokes around smoky fires, arguments over rations, letters written by dim light, and men staring toward home while wondering whether home still remembered them. Washington's headquarters at the Isaac Potts House became the nerve center of the army. Couriers arrived and departed, aides copied letters. Officers gathered around tables, maps spread across rooms that were never quiet for long. Outside, the camp struggled. Inside, decisions accumulated. Martha Washington arrived in February 1778, as she had joined her husband in previous winter quarters. Her presence did not magically soften Valley Forge, but it mattered. She managed domestic arrangements, received officers and visitors, helped create a small sphere of stability, and reminded the army that Washington was not only a symbol, but a husband living under strain. Headquarters society could seem strange beside the suffering in the huts. Officers dined when enlisted men went hungry. Visitors came and went. Rank mattered. Inequality did not disappear because the cause spoke of liberty. But morale in an army depends on rituals as well as rations. A meal, a conversation, a clean shirt, a letter from home, a familiar face, or a commander seen walking through camp could help men endure another day. Religious life also continued. Chaplains preached, soldiers prayed. Some cursed more than they prayed. The revolution drew together men of different regions, denominations, languages, and habits. New Englanders, Pennsylvanians, Virginians, Marylanders, New Yorkers, New Jersey men, and others learned one another's accents and prejudices in close quarters. Military justice operated too. Desertion, theft, drunkenness, and disobedience brought punishment. Discipline could be harsh. Washington believed the army needed order to survive, but order was difficult to impose on hungry men. Commanders had to balance severity with the knowledge that many offenses came from misery. Outside the camp, civilians had their own calculations. Some farmers sold to the army, some hid goods, some preferred British money, some feared requisition parties, some supported independence but resented the burdens of feeding soldiers. War did not simply happen on battlefields, it entered barns, kitchens, mills, churches, and markets. By late winter, the camp had become a test of the revolution's social machinery. Could Congress supply an army? Could states cooperate? Could civilians support a long war? Could officers keep authority? Could soldiers keep faith? The answers were uneven, frustrating, and incomplete. But the army was still there. That fact mattered every morning. Each day, the British looked out from Philadelphia and saw that Washington had not gone away. Each day, Congress continued under threat, but not surrender. Each day, the army remained in being. The British victory in Philadelphia became less decisive. Then, in February, a new figure arrived at Valley Forge who would change the daily life of the camp. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge with a title, a uniform, a strong personality, and a talent the army badly needed. He was a Prussian-trained officer, though his European rank and history were later polished for American consumption. What mattered most was not the legend, but the usefulness. He understood drill, discipline, organization, and how to turn theory into habit. The Continental Army had brave men. It had experienced fighters. It had officers who had learned under fire. But it did not yet have consistent training across units. Commands varied. Maneuvers were uneven. Camp sanitation needed improvement. Inspections lacked uniformity. A battle line could not depend on courage alone. It needed shared language, repeated practice, and trust that the unit beside you would move when expected. Von Steuben began with a model company. He trained a small group intensely, then used those men to teach others. His method was practical. Instead of drowning soldiers in European complexity, he adapted. He cursed, joked, demonstrated, corrected, and repeated. When language failed, he used translators. When patience failed, colorful profanity reportedly filled the air. The men liked him more than they might have liked a colder disciplinarian. He showed them what he wanted, He did not merely shout from a distance. He stepped into the work. He made drill feel connected to survival. He also improved camp order. Sanitation, layout, inspections, and discipline all mattered. An army that camps badly becomes sick. An army that cannot move together cannot fight well. An army that cannot load, wheel, march, and reform under pressure is only a crowd with muskets. Washington recognized the value quickly. Here was a foreign officer who did not simply demand rank or glory, but offered a tool the army needed. Von Steuben's training would later become the basis for American drill manuals. At Valley Forge, its effect was immediate enough to be felt in posture, confidence, and movement. Imagine the parade ground in late winter. Men still hungry, men still poorly clothed, snow melting into mud, officers watching as commands moved down the line. Soldiers who had once learned mostly by battlefield necessity now repeated motions until they became instinct. Muskets rose together, feet shifted together, lines dressed more cleanly, orders became clearer. This was not romantic suffering. This was work. Valley Forge became a school. The price of admission was misery, but the lesson was cohesion. The army did not become perfect. It did not become European in every way. It remained American, improvised, varied, stubborn, and often undersupplied. But it became more capable. That transformation would matter when the army left the hills and faced the British again. While von Steuben drilled the army in Pennsylvania, diplomacy reshaped the war across the Atlantic. Saratoga had changed the calculation in Versailles. France had aided the Americans secretly before, but open alliance was a different matter. It meant war with Britain. It meant fleets, money, global strategy, and risk. The French court did not act out of charity alone. France wanted revenge for earlier defeat. It wanted to weaken Britain. It wanted influence. But the American victory at Saratoga gave French ministers confidence that the rebellion might survive. In February 1778, France and the United States signed treaties of alliance and commerce. News traveled slowly, but when it reached America, it changed the emotional weather. The revolution was no longer a lonely colonial rebellion facing the British Empire by itself. It had a powerful ally. French ships could challenge British naval control. French money and supplies could help sustain the war. French recognition gave the United States diplomatic legitimacy. At Valley Forge, the news became ceremony. On May 6, 1778, the army celebrated the French alliance with a grand review. Soldiers who had starved through winter now formed ranks. Cannon fired, muskets discharged in salute, cheers rose for the King of France, for the friendly European ally, for the United States, and for Washington. The scene had layers of irony. An army fighting for Republican independence, cheering a king because that king's rivalry with Britain might save the revolution. Washington understood the importance. Ceremony told the soldiers that their suffering had meaning beyond the hills. It told them the world had not forgotten them. It told them Saratoga had mattered. It told them that the winter might be giving way not only to spring, but to a new phase of war. Lafayette's position became even more valuable. He represented both personal loyalty and the French connection. To soldiers, he was no longer simply a young nobleman seeking adventure. He had bled with them at Brandywine, endured alongside them, and stood as a living sign that France and America were now linked. The British understood the change too. Once France entered the war, British strategy had to widen. The empire had to protect the Caribbean, watch the Atlantic, defend trade routes, and prepare for conflict beyond North America. Holding Philadelphia no longer looked as useful as it had when Howe captured it. A city could become a burden if fleets and armies were needed elsewhere. General Sir Henry Clinton replaced Howe as British commander-in-chief. Orders came to consolidate. Philadelphia would be evacuated. For Washington, the news opened a question. Could the army that had suffered at Valley Forge move quickly enough to strike the British as they crossed New Jersey? The answer would be tested in heat, not snow. On June 19, 1778, the Continental Army left Valley Forge. The departure did not erase what had happened there. The dead remained part of the place. The huts, trenches, ashes, hospitals, and graves marked the cost of survival. But the army marching out was not the same army that had marched in. It was still imperfect. It still lacked much. It still depended on fragile supply systems and uncertain politics. But it had endured. It had trained. It had reorganized. It had seen Washington survive criticism. It had seen France enter the war. It had spent months learning how to move with greater discipline. The British evacuation of Philadelphia created opportunity. Clinton's army moved across New Jersey with a long baggage train, loyalists, supplies, and civilians who feared remaining behind. The column was large and vulnerable, but still dangerous. British regulars remained among the best soldiers in the world. Washington pursued. His officers debated how aggressively to act. Some wanted a strong attack. Others feared risking the army against British regulars. Charles Lee, restored after captivity and still convinced of his own brilliance, argued caution. Lafayette and others favored action. Washington first gave command of the advance to Lee after Lee requested it. The decision placed a difficult man in a difficult moment. Lee had experience, but he lacked faith in the American army and seemed uncertain about Washington's intentions. The advance force moved toward the British near Monmouth Courthouse. June 28, 1778, became brutally hot. Heat shaped the battle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Thirst became dangerous. Wool uniforms, dust, smoke, and sun turned the field into a furnace. This was the opposite of Valley Forge's winter image, and yet it was the same test in another form. Could the army endure conditions that punished the body while maintaining order? Lee's advance made contact with the British rear guard under Cornwallis. Confusion followed. Orders were unclear. American units shifted, probed, and then began to fall back. Whether Lee intended a controlled maneuver or lost his grip on the situation became a matter of bitter dispute. What Washington saw when he rode forward was an advance force retreating in disorder. The confrontation between Washington and Lee became one of the most dramatic moments of the war. Washington, usually controlled, was furious. Accounts differ in details, but the emotional truth is clear. The commander-in-chief found his battle plan unraveling and demanded answers. Then came the real test. Could Washington stop retreat from becoming collapse? Washington rallied the army at Monmouth. He placed units on strong ground. Greene, Wayne, Sterling, Knox, and others helped form a defensive line. Artillery took position. Infantry dressed ranks. Men who had trained under von Steuben now had to prove that drill mattered under fire. The British attacked in the heat. Cannon roared, muskets fired across fields and hedgerows. Smoke hung over dry ground. Men fell from wounds, but also from heat. Horses suffered. Officers rode through dust, trying to hold lines together. Anthony Wayne's men fought hard. Greene's position helped anchor the American line. Knox's artillery punished British movements. The Continentals did not break. They stood. That was the point. Monmouth was not Saratoga. It did not end with a British army surrendering. It did not produce a clean, dramatic victory where one side vanished from the field. Clinton withdrew during the night and continued toward New York. The British army survived. But for Washington, Monmouth mattered because the Continental Army had faced British regulars in open battle and held its own. The army that had stumbled into Valley Forge had come out capable of standing under pressure. The battle also produced legends. One of the most famous is Molly Pitcher, often associated with Mary Ludwig Hayes, a woman said to have carried water to soldiers and helped at a cannon after her husband fell. The details of the legend are layered and debated, but the story points toward a real truth. Women were present around armies, doing dangerous labor and sometimes stepping directly into the violence of battle. Charles Lee's reputation did not recover. He was court-martialed after the battle and found guilty on charges connected to disobedience and misconduct. His conflict with Washington became another reminder that the Revolution's leadership was not a harmonious painting. It was a room full of egos, fears, ideals, resentments, and ambitions held together only when the cause demanded it. For the British, Monmouth was a withdrawal, not a disaster. Clinton reached New York. The war continued. There would be no quick end. For the Americans, the battle confirmed something important. Valley Forge had not been meaningless suffering. The months of hunger, training, political endurance, and alliance building had changed the army's confidence and capacity. The Revolution had entered a new phase. The British no longer held Philadelphia. France was now openly in the war. Washington's army had survived winter and tested itself in summer. The conflict would spread to the seas, to the Caribbean, to frontier settlements, to the south, and eventually toward Yorktown. But before those later campaigns, there was this moment, a dusty field in New Jersey where the army of Valley Forge stood its ground. Valley Forge is often remembered as a symbol of suffering. That memory is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Suffering alone does not win wars. Hunger alone does not create liberty. Cold alone does not transform an army. What mattered at Valley Forge was what people did inside the suffering. Soldiers built huts, women labored, surgeons treated the sick, officers argued and adapted. Washington wrote, pleaded, disciplined, and endured. Von Steuben trained. Lafayette stayed loyal. Congress struggled, often badly, to support the army. Civilians negotiated the burdens of a war that came into their barns and roads. Black soldiers served in a cause that still had not resolved the meaning of freedom. Valley Forge changed the army because it forced the revolution to become more than a burst of resistance. It had to become an institution, a camp, a supply system, a command structure, a diplomatic partner, a disciplined fighting force. The transformation was not clean. It was not guaranteed. It was not a myth unfolding according to destiny. It was work done by exhausted people under pressure. When the army marched into Valley Forge in December 1777, it was shadowed by defeat. Philadelphia was occupied. Washington was criticized. Supplies were failing. The alliance with France was not yet public. The future was uncertain. When the army marched out in June 1778, Philadelphia was being abandoned by the British. France had joined the war. Washington still commanded. Von Steuben's training had taken root. The Continentals could meet the British at Monmouth and stand. That did not mean independence was secure. The war would become more complex, more global, and in many regions more brutal. The frontier would burn. The South would become a central theater. Betrayal would come. Yorktown was still years away. But Valley Forge answered one question the British had been asking since the war began. Would the rebellion grow tired enough to quit? In the winter of 1777 and 1778, the answer was written in smoke rising from rough huts, in footprints through snow and mud, in drill commands on a parade ground, in letters sent to Congress, in cheers for France, and in the line that held at Monmouth. The army had suffered. But more importantly, the army had remained. And because it remained, the revolution remained alive.